In Secrets of Strixhaven, one card might break Legacy, but how will it fare in Vintage? All right, welcome back, Vintage gamers, to a Secrets of Strixhaven card preview video. We are currently recording this on Sunday, so that means it will air on Monday. Cards will be on Magic Online on Tuesday, and so by Wednesday we will start seeing Secrets of Strixhaven videos on the channel. I'm also taking part in the Box Bootcamp right now, so this is a good way to do a bit of an easier recording. And I think there are some really good cards to talk about in this upcoming set, and it will be pretty interesting. So let's start things off with the card that I am the most excited about, but is probably not the best card, Emeritus of Ideation. This is a reprint of Ancestral Recall. Kind of. I will say this will make a very nice Ancestral Recall proxy if you were to play in paper Vintage events. Black out all this top side, or maybe make a fun drawing on the top side and get nice Ancestral Recall. I think the other print of it is a pretty good one as well. Either way, what is this? This is a 3 blue for a 5/5 flying ward 2. This creature enters prepared. Whenever this creature attacks, you may exile 8 cards from your graveyard. If you do, this creature becomes prepared. So first, let's talk about what is prepared. I don't think the actual rules text is out yet, but the preview article is. So let's read that. If a creature with a prepared spell comes in prepared, a copy of the prepared spell appears in exile. So if you get prepared, a copy is put into exile, and that copy stays in exile until one of 3 things happen. You cast it, the prepared creature leaves, or the prepared creature becomes unprepared. And the casting is like any other spell, fixing the time wing windows. One of the more important things, though, is when you cast a prepared spell from exile, it becomes unprepared, and you can never be able to create more than 1 copy of a prepared spell in exile. You need to cast the copy of the prepared spell, or have that copy cease to exist before the creature becomes unprepared to gain access to another copy. So some restrictions there. Why am I excited about Ancestral Recall on a big creature? Because I've played cards like this before in a very specific style of deck. A deck I really enjoy. It's never been, not say never been. It hasn't been in recent memory a very strong deck, but it has won Vintage Championships, and that would be like Fair Oath, Brian Kelly Oath style. Brian Kelly won a Vintage Championship playing the style of Oath back of many years ago now, I think. But what is this style of Oath? So this is like a 2 Oath, no Orchard, fair creature that you can cast plan. That's the basic way to summarize this. And it just is a shift in ideology on what you're trying to accomplish with your Oath of Druids. You know, the number one way people play Oath of Druids is play it as fast as possible, give an opponent a creature as fast as possible, and put the largest and most powerful creature in Magic into play as fast as possible. And so they accomplish that with Full Moxen, they accomplish that with Forbidden Orchard, and they put into play things like Atraxa. This is a different approach. This is, I'm playing a blue, sometimes Planeswalker-based control deck, and if my opponent happens to play a creature, I have access to a spell that reads 1 in a green, flip cards in your library until you find, your best creature. And what we can do is make the best creature something that you don't have to Oath into. So Atraxa and other creatures like it are 7-8 mana, hard to cast. Historically, the cards that Brian Kelly was playing in this kind of Oath deck were 6 mana cards, things like Inferno Titan, Sun Titan, Dragon Lord Dramoka, those kind of cards. And even in recent memory, we've played things as small as Pyroglyph at 4 mana, because these creatures are still very powerful to Oath into, because as Magic gets older, creatures get more powerful. And so you can actually see in this deck where you are Oathing into Loot, which is basically a very similar card to this Ancestral on a Stick. Loot has Ancestral on it, but needs to tap and use blue mana to do it, though. But it also has a Lightning Bolt and add 3 mana as well. So instead of being a card that you need to have green, blue, and red, which could be prohibitive, instead of being a 2/4 double strike vigilance haste, And instead of having to tap to cast Ancestral, instead we get a 5/5 flying Ward 2, not a really strong text actually, 5/5 flying Ward 2. This can win the game on its own. It's harder to kill. And it also can rebuy Ancestral multiple times because its second synergy actually plays really well with Oath of Druids. So this comes into play. My idea is, oh, well, they played a creature, so I can play 2 mana, play an Oath, and on my next turn, I get a 5/5 flying Ward 2, 1 mana to play Ancestral Recall, and then whenever this attacks, I can exile 8 cards from my yard, and I get more Ancestral Recalls. So I think it fits really well into a very specific style of deck, which is this deck. I would be hesitant to see this card be played in any other kind of deck, just because 5 mana for a creature is very prohibitive. It would need to like win the game or do something for smaller amounts of mana. But being able to Oath into it, where you still can cast this in a longer, drawn-out Planeswalker control game, makes a lot of sense to me. So you can expect to see 1 or 2 videos at least of me trying to play this kind of fair deck. One of the other things that I really like about this is that it's not red where loot is red, so I'm not forced into playing these red cards. Not that these red cards are bad by any means, but I could choose to play different colors, maybe play white for Teferi, for Swords of Plowshares, play a true... I usually find that like some of the best control decks in the format are usually blue-white. And so if I can play a blue-white splashing like Oko Oath, Emeritus control deck, that sounds very appealing to me, and that's why this card I'm the most excited for. We have a couple other cards here, 2 that are on the smaller side and 2 that are on the larger side that will take more discussion. First, we have Erode. Erode is a Path to Exile style card that destroys instead of exiles and can hit planeswalkers. Right now, I don't think this card will see play in Vintage because I don't believe that there are enough decks playing planeswalkers to warrant you losing the exile effect. The put a basic land into play tapped is actually not the most relevant in Vintage a lot of the time. Especially because a lot of these decks will have Wastelands in it anyways. People will be already fetching their 1 basic, that kind of thing. But the Destroy is highly relevant right now. Destroy target creature is a lot worse than Exile target creature, and that is because of Lurrus. So with Lurrus existing as one of the main decks in the format, if you are to destroy a Bowmaster or destroy a Frog instead of exiling it, it's a big deal. So I think that this is a card that people should be aware is printed, and a tool you have access to as a blue-white deck in a case where we eventually somehow go back to a Planeswalker-centric metagame. Having access to a 1-mana way to remove a Planeswalker is very powerful, but not currently relevant, is how I would put it. So I want to highlight this card as a card you need to be aware of, especially because I always am talking about the idea that blue decks are a toolbox. You have 30 years of Magic cards to play with and build to answer very specific things. And so this is just another way your blue deck can play against Planeswalkers. If this card had existed maybe during the very heavy Planeswalker eras of Karn and Narset, does that change anything? Maybe, maybe not. The Karn deck maybe has to play a waste, which would be pretty interesting. I'm not sure that it does, for what it's worth, but this is the kind of card that was definitely not in existence at the time and might have been a way to allow those cards to not have taken over the format in the same degree they did. And that's just maybes, but this is the kind of card that is new to existence that we need to talk about. Talking about cards that are new to existence, this is, I think, a first for this exact style of card. Flashback is exactly what you think it is. Target instant sorcery in your graveyard gains Flashback until end of turn. I want to highlight this card because I don't have a particular immediate use for it. However, I think it's incredibly powerful and could be a linchpin to some kind of new style of deck. This is the kind of card I expect someone like Sean, Dissolutionist, to brew with and maybe be able to exploit in a way that I am not seeing right away. But the biggest problem with this card is it kind of plays in the same place as Snapcaster Mage. And so a lot of the times when you want this style effect, you'd rather have a Snapcaster Mage. But it is also a redundant version of this effect, which can be important for something like a Gifts Ungiven pile, where you need to have I want to be able to use my Gifts Ungiven to tutor for 2 flashback effects. And currently, like, those cards can end up being slightly you can be pushed into like Noxious Revival territory, which is not always the best. But if you can double up on a bunch of different ways of doing that effect, it might be relevant. I don't know that would push the tipping point of some kind of deck utilizing this effect. But I think it's important to recognize that it could, in case that something like that does end up being created. Now we're getting on to some of the big hits here. Petrified Hamlet. This is a card that had a lot of talk on Twitter. People were DMing me and tagging me a lot about this card. Bizarre players were losing their minds, but I don't actually think it's going to hit as hard as people think it will. So what is this card? This is a card that people have actually asked for quite a long time. I've seen this be a suggested card in Discords for many years now. This is a needle on a land. So when this land enters, choose a land card. So it's a needle on very specifically lands. Activated abilities of the sources with the chosen name cannot be activated unless they are mana abilities. Lands with the chosen name get to tap for a colorless. This taps for a colorless itself. So very specifically only hits lands. What are the lands that this is going to hit in Vintage? Number 1, Bazaar of Baghdad, or maybe number 1, Wasteland. Those are the 2 big ones. There are other ones like one of Sagas and one of Strip Mines and that kind of thing. But by far and away, the 2 things this is going to do is either prevent you from being wastelanded or prevent your opponent from using Bazaar. Now, we need to figure out what decks can play this card and what decks want this effect. Actually, funnily enough, the deck that might want this effect the most is Bazaar of Baghdad decks, because Bazaar of Baghdad decks historically have trouble with getting wastelanded. If you maybe played something like Squee and you started with a Petrified field on the play, and then your Bazaar can never be wastelanded, that is an upside. Is it an upside worth taking an entire turn off to do? Probably not, but maybe. It depends on the matchup, right? If it's so crucial in the matchup that you need to make sure your Bazaar stays in play, then maybe it's actually very important. And for a deck like Squee, as opposed to something like Dredge, you're okay sometimes passing the turn on the first turn if you have the requisite counter spells to continue the game from there. For Dredge, on the other hand, 1 turn is a long time. And this is a topic that actually came up a lot with Urza Saga, and people didn't really seem to agree with me that Urza Saga has a cost of playing a land. Playing a land is a huge cost. You get to play 1 land per turn, and when you play a land that doesn't make blue mana as an Urza Saga deck, it's a huge tempo loss. And that is my problem with this card in the context of non-Bazaar, non-workshop decks. In the context of blue decks, who is willing to take a turn off to either turn off Wastelands against themselves or turn off Bazaars? Now, I think any deck in the format is willing to take a turn off to prevent Bazaar if they're on the play. I think that's fine. Everyone gets that. But the games where you're on the play are not really the games you're super worried about. And maybe being on the play is enough. Maybe you combine this with the existing on the draw Bazaar hate like Leyline and it's fine. But I'm worried that this card is probably not good enough against Bazaar on the draw a lot of the time if it's Dredge. Because they've already put the cards in the yard. You're taking a whole turn to turn off Bazaar. Like Wastelanding a Bazaar is a good play, but it's not the end of the world against Dredge on turn 1. That's what I'm worried about. And I'm worried about how do you fit this into your game plan? Because one of the things is, if you play this, you're not probably casting, if you're not Golos deck or not a workshop deck, you're probably not casting any other spells that turn. So those are the things I'm super worried about from the blue perspective. I don't think there's any blue deck that wants to play this card to stop Wastelands, because it's like wastelanding yourself. If you have to take the whole turn to play a colorless land in your blue deck, and then it's like what did I even accomplish in terms of tempo? It's really going to put you behind. So that kind of leaves us at the point where the deck that truly wants this card the most, besides Bazaar, is workshop decks that can tutor it. Because playing a colorless land, a 1-mana colorless land, is not the end of the world for their deck. Playing it in a toolbox where Golos can go fetch it is actually very reasonable. That being said, if Golos is fetching this land, when are we playing a Golos? Because a Golos is a 5-mana creature. Are we playing a Golos on turn 2 and fetching this? Is that quick enough? Is that better than like wastelanding your opponent's land? So I'm like, I can't imagine that Golos decks won't play this card, but I am concerned that it's not as effective as you'd want it to be. So a lot of weird caveats here because of, I think the effect is powerful, but the timing window of the effect is very hard to manage, and I'm very concerned. So I would expect that this comes out of the gates blazing. People might play a couple copies in their sideboard to try it out against Bazaar. I think it's fine on the play against Bazaar. It's always going to be fine on the play against Bazaar, but is playing a colorless land on the draw against Bazaar, like, you know, you don't typically see a wasteland, right, in Tinker. So like, would Tinker play this card in its sideboard on, on the draw and on the play to beat the Dredge instead of a Needle that they can tutor for with Saga, or play off of off-color Moxen and still advance their blue mana? It strikes me as hard to grasp if that's a worthwhile cost benefit. So that's what I'm thinking about when I'm looking at this card. And I actually do think it might be that this card is actually best inside of Bazaar, which is quite funny to me. And I want to preface this by saying I could be wrong. This is just my initial gut analysis of the tempo of this card. And, another part of this is, if it's good against Wasteland, say it's good against Wasteland and blue decks, then you'll see a lot of this card because Wasteland is one of the most played cards in all of Vintage. If it's good against Bazaar, how many decks actually want this card? Because Bazaar right now is still around 10% of the metagame, but it's one of the worst decks in the metagame. It's a deck that frequently has very poor win rates, is usually under 50% win rate. It's a deck that will always see play and continues to see play regardless of win rate because of its cost on Magic Online, it's ubiquitous in the format, pillar of the format, that kind of thing. But how many of these can you really play if you're only starting to play against 10% Dredge in a metagame? Just things to think about. And finally, the card that might break Legacy, but how will it do in Vintage? Flow State. So we need to read this card because there's one very important word that many people skipped over in the initial reading of this card. This is a 1 and a blue sorcery. Look at the top 3 cards, put 1 into your hand and the rest on the bottom in any order. Not the most powerful card, but if there is an instant and a sorcery in your graveyard, keyword there is and. You need an instant and a sorcery in your graveyard. Put 2 of the cards from your hand and the rest in the bottom of your library in any order. So it's not going in your graveyard. This card is most similar to Expressive Iteration. That was a blue and a red sorcery that got banned in Legacy. Look at the top 3 cards, 1 into your hand, 1 into the bottom, and 1 into exile that you may cast this turn. No condition on that other than the card you're putting into exile you need to be able to cast right away to get its value. And then the other condition of Expressive Iteration is blue and a red. Now, in Legacy, a little bit of a slower format, that was no problem. In Vintage, you saw very little Expressive Iteration being played because of its blue and a red casting cost. Blue and a red means you can't really cast it off turn 1 off-color Moxen, which is one of the bigger upsides of these kind of cards. So, an Expressive Iteration has seen some play in Vintage. It's not a bad card by any means, but it's not seen like crazy play for a card you expect, when it gets banned in Legacy. Now, for Vintage, this solves some of the problems of Expressive Iteration and pushes us towards a place of a card that we've always really wanted in Vintage, which Tinker decks historically always wanted to play a card that read 1 in a blue, draw 2 cards. And like typically the closest card for that was 1 in a black, draw 2 cards, lose 2 life in Night's Whisper. But this card could be even better because it's not drawing cards, and we all know that drawing cards in Vintage right now has a cost applied to it because of Orcish Bowmaster. You don't want to draw cards. That's part of the reason why Stock Up is so good, is that you are not actually drawing cards. So the 2 things we need to think about are how hard is it to get an instant sorcery in graveyard before you cast this? How early can you do that? And that kind of points to a thing that we talked about earlier with Oath of Druids. Remember how we talked about Oath of Druids had, in the case of the loot deck here, a different goal than Oath of Druids and Atraxa. And that's true of Flow State as well. So if we were to pull up 2 maybe different decks that could try to play this card, we can talk about the 2 different roles. So I think one you could talk about is Doomsday, right? Why Doomsday? Well, Doomsday can fulfill the requirement of sorcery and instant fairly easily. Why? Every deck is going to be able to do instant not too hard because every deck has Force of Will. That's a blue deck. Not as many decks have sorceries. So this deck actually, gets to play a 1-mana sorcery in Ponder and Preordain. In 1-mana instance in Dark Ritual Consider. So when you play Doomsday, if you played a flow state, your goal wouldn't be to play it on turn 1 with no modes or modes online. Your goal would always be to play it on turn 2 with the and active. And that seems very achievable, right? We're talking about tons of sorceries, bunch of instants, and a lot of them are 1 mana. I think it's worth noting before we go too deep that Force of Will is your free instant that can help you turn this card on. And then also Mental Misstep and Probe are also free instants that can help turn this card on. Things to consider in terms of all the decks that play this card will technically be able to play it on turn 1, assuming some kind of 0 mana spells happen. It won't be a consistent thing, but you always do have that upside of being a turn 1 thing. So if Doomsday wants a 2 mana, look at the top 3 cards, take 2 and put them in your hand, this card would fit in Doomsday. And this is kind of how it will fit in legacy decks, especially Delver decks and that kind of thing. But does Doomsday want that? I don't know that that's obviously true. It just doesn't seem like 2 mana for 1 card is what Doomsday wants to be doing. You really want to be able to do these 1 mana spells. So I don't think it'll be bad in Doomsday, but I don't think it's game breaking or a huge card. And if it is played in Doomsday, it won't be a 4-up. Now, let's go back to what we were talking about when we talked about 1 in a blue, draw 2, sorcery. What deck wanted that? Tinker. Tinker wants that card. So can Tinker play Flow State? That's a little bit harder to say. I don't actually know if I have a Tinker deck right away here. Maybe this one. What is this? Oh God. Oh no. Tinker deck. They're all crazy. Everyone's playing crazy Tinker deck. Where is the Esper Tinker deck? Sure. Let's try using this one. So Tinker is always wants that. One of the problems that Tinker will have is sorceries ahead of time and enough instants to make sure you have an instant in your yard. Because if your goal is to play a turn 1 flow state with the and, which is the powerful way of playing this card, I think without and, it's not that powerful. You need to, 1, have a Moxen. So that's something that Tinker can do. Tinker can have the off-color Moxen to play this on turn 1. But how is Tinker going to get an instant and sorcery in the yard? Theoretically, you could, instead of playing stock-ups, play Ponders. But then you're, again, looking at playing this on turn 2. Maybe not as strong. Maybe if this card without the and is feasible enough, then it can be its own sorcery for the next copy. But then you have to have 2 copies of it, and you're still playing it on turn 2, probably. You can have Stock Up be a sorcery that triggers this, but then you're casting this on what, turn 3, turn later? You're turning it into more of a late game card. You're not kind of filling the gap of your early game. Because one of the problems that some of these PO decks had was oh, they're a bit clunky. They need Moxen to work. And that's why you're seeing, it's part of the reason you're seeing things like Thundertrap Trainer. Is this card better than Thundertrap Trainer in PO? It feels hard to justify, right? Thundertrap Trainer has the body, is a wizard to turn on flame, comes back with Luris, and you're looking at 4 cards instead of 3 cards. The difference is that Thundertrap Trainer can't grab creatures and lands, whereas this can. And that's important. That's not a small caveat. Thundertrap not grabbing lands can be harmful, especially when you're getting null rotted or you're trying to build out your mana base. So you see where the push and pull here is. I don't think that just having access to Force of Will is enough, because maybe you don't have a Force of Will target right away. And then how are we going to get enough spells? Well, we have other instants, right? We have things like chains and flusterstorms and swords. But once we start talking, and even POs, once we start talking about that, then this card becomes not about playing it on turn one. And I felt that the reason Tinker decks in the past wanted access to 1 in a blue, draw 2 is because it's the perfect turn one play. I get to use my off-color mana, I get to fetch a basic island, and I get to put new cards in my hand to fill up towards a Tinker or a PO or something like that. And that's part of the reason why I think Thunder Trap Trainer is so strong right now in PO, is because it's really pushing you towards that game plan. And so I don't know that there are enough instants and sorceries to get into your yard as fast as you need them to in current builds of that, that might want this card. Because I do think to maximize this card's potential, you do want it in that 5-color off-color Moxens, not a 5-color deck, but a deck with 5 colors of Moxen, because then you're really getting able to abuse the 1 colorless mana here and play this earlier than intended. The problem is playing earlier than intended. It does not necessarily mean you have instants and sorceries in your yard. So do we think this will see play in Vintage? I kind of feel that it will be tried and then discarded, because I just don't see a deck that efficiently utilizes this. And now we're talking about roles again. We're talking about what's your goal with the card. And if you reframe and you don't think you need to cast this on turn one as an and, then you get a lot more room. If you think that this card can be used similar to Stock Up as a way to power through and refuel on later turns, then maybe it makes sense. And I just don't know how often you're allowed to have that luxury in the current state of Vintage when we're talking about decks like Rigger Shops that are putting lethals on the table on turn 1 and turn 2. We're talking about decks like Dredge, which don't care that you're taking time to try to find cards, or Shops that is prohibiting your ability to play your artifacts out or your artifact mana or that kind of thing. So in a format like Legacy, where you're going to go turn 1, ponder, preordain, I don't know, maybe, force or daze or something, your opponent's spell, and then this can be on turn 2 or 3. Obviously, not on turn 2 if you're dazed, but when you have all of these, classic cantrip engines going, then it's so much easier. Then you also have access to Brainstorm to turn on instant. So, we're missing a lot of the tools and not only a lot of the tools, but also a lot of the use cases that would make this card good in Legacy that will probably not make it as good in Vintage. So, so basically I am on a doubter. I'm the doubter here. And it's kind of funny because I ended up being one of the people in the Discord who was like, arguing for the merit of this card, because people were being extremely doubting, and it's always a kind of a tough battle to engage in when people are being hyperbolic about, wow, this card is too good, wow, this card is too bad, and you need to try to juxtapose it and get somewhere to a voice of reason. You don't end up sometimes in the position that you actually want to be arguing for, which is a bit awkward. Classic online internet problem. So let's go back over the cards we did talk about. And if there are any more cards you want to talk about, feel free to put them in the comments below. I'll throw a comment down and give you my interpretation of that card. But you have our Ancestral Recall on a stick. I don't think this card is good, but this card is the card that makes me the happiest. And I'm going to play it inside of this kind of fair Brian Kelly Luris deck, or Brian Kelly Oath deck, not Luris. Erode, which I don't think we'll see immediate play, but is a great toolbox answer for Planeswalkers for the format. Flashback, which I don't think we'll see immediate play unless Sean, Dissolutionist, finds a way to break it in some kind of combo-oriented shell. Petrified Hamlet will see the most immediate play. This card will be seeing play in Vintage. The question is who can play it, how much of this card can they play, and what's the longevity of this card in the format as a primary answer to either Bazaar or Wasteland. Remember, the key here is if this card is good in blue decks against Wasteland, then it will see extreme amounts of play. If this card is only good against Bazaar, it's only going to be seeing play in decks that it makes sense to see play in, and it might even be seeing play the most in Bazaar sideboards. And then for Flow State, I do think that this card is likely to be very good in Legacy, but for Vintage, I'm not currently seeing a build that fulfills breaking this card. I can see builds that make this card reasonable, like Doomsday, or like if you're playing for a longer game inside of some deck that plays 1-mana sorceries. But the problem is those decks don't really exist in Vintage as it currently stands. And what you really were looking to do is try to make this card broken on turn 1 or turn 2, at worst on turn 2. And when you start pushing towards that, it's hard to see, what deck would want this, especially when PO won't want this because it's worse than Thundertrap Trainer. I'm not even sure PO would want the 1 in a blue draw 2 anymore in comparison to Thundertrap Trainer. Thundertrap Trainer is that good in the PO decks. But if for some reason, I think the place that makes the most sense outside of Doomsday for this card, if there was a big blue deck that would use it, it would be a Tinker style deck that's looking to put together AB combos. This is a card that deck might want. So if you are that kind of player who is still playing Bolus's Citadel, take a look at this card and see if you can find a way to break it. And I will be happy to play your deck if you can do well with it. That is all for Secrets of Strixhaven. Which cards excite you? Let me know in the comments, and I'll definitely comment down there below. And starting Wednesday, we should start seeing leagues with all of these fresh new cards. More vintage content on this YouTube channel every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I'll see you then.